establish what our scheme of things is, and to add to those one-liners whatever encouragement I need to, for you to feel free to ask questions, make comments, seek clarification of things that may not be absolutely clear to you. I'm not certain I can make them absolutely clear, because there are some of these areas in which we have to be a little bit conjectural, but increasingly we have evidence to support our understanding of what family life was like in the world of the book of Genesis. We are going to look at family life in the Old Testament really under three headings. Yesterday we spent a lot of time talking about family life and sexual mores at the time of the nomadic era, what we generally have known as the patriarchal era. In our second phase, we'll move into that today. We will begin to look at family life as it is reflected in the codes that Moses gave Israel. Some of those look back to the nomadic era and put into legislative form codification, if you would, of the principles that were already generally accepted mores in the ancient world. Others were looking forward to the time of settlement in the land of Canaan and rules and regulations that would govern husband and wife relationships there. So we're going to look at the nomadic era, the Mosaic legislation, and family life after settlement in Canaan as sort of the three windows through which we look at this issue. In the last 40 or 50 years, we've come to understand a lot more about the dynamic of these interesting stories in the book of Genesis, stories that often have details associated with them that are strange sounding to us, because of two or three things that have happened. One is there have been attempts on the part of sociologists to study cultures very much like Abraham's family that happen to still exist in remote areas of Saudi Arabia today, particularly the mountain Bedouins. Still practice many of these same cultural phenomena that look so strange to us when we read the book of Genesis and the books of Moses, in which some marital customs and some values toward marriage itself and sexuality within marriage are practiced still widely. And it gives the researcher an opportunity not only to look at what dynamic is within a society that causes a society to structure family life that way. The other thing that has happened is that we have, through a couple of archaeological serendipities, I suppose I should say, come across vast caches of material that is out of the royal archives. In one case, in the case of the Eblaic civilization, the archives of a kingdom we didn't even know existed, and it existed right where Abraham lived most of his life. And the nation of Ebla, or the kingdom of Ebla, flourished in the early 2nd millennium BC and the late 3rd millennium BC, carried on thriving political and economic activity through the upper Tigris-Euphrates area. And a few years ago, in a section of what is now Syria, some archaeologists, thinking they were digging into a rather insignificant city site, happened to dig right into the king's archives for this culture. And suddenly we uncovered thousands and thousands and thousands of cuneiform tablets that give us a magnificent picture of what the social customs and the marital and family regulations of the day were. Much of that material still has not been translated, but as it begins to be translated, all of a sudden a lot of things in the book of Genesis start making sense to us, because now we see how those things were done in their society. We understand a whole lot more about covenant making, for instance, as a result of this, because we have recovered an awful lot of covenant documents that then make some statements in Moses' writing much clearer to us, because we understand how covenants were put together in that day. Yesterday, as we were coming to the end, we had not quite finished talking about the nomadic era. We had suggested that in this period, do we end up with no chalk up here today? Oh, yeah, here we go. Got one piece. In this nomadic era that Genesis tends to focus on, we must think of family not as mom, dad, and the kids, but as a clan of 75, 100, 200, 300 people who live together, work together, and move together as a unit. It is a very authoritarian structure. The patriarch literally is the king over this small kingdom. He sets the rules, he sets the regulations. Within these patriarchal communities that move together, we noted that there was a real propensity for women to marry within their family, sisters, or one man marrying two sisters in the case of Jacob. But even here he is marrying two sisters who are cousins. Why is there the tendency for people, particularly women, to marry within the clan? And we suggested that there are 3 or 4 reasons for that. Number one is these are nomadic people. If you marry into another clan and it moves north and your family moves east, you may never see your parents again. Your grandchildren will not have the benefit of your parents as their grandparents. Number two, as a woman, you go into a new pecking order in a clan that is tied together by blood, and you've got to establish your place. If you lose your husband rather early in establishing yourself in that clan, you're going to be the odd person out from then on. There will really be no one to take care of you in your old age, whereas if you're in your own clan and you lose your family, the clan will rally around you and take care of you and see that your old age is provided for. A third reason that you married within the clan is that a man was expected to take to a woman's father a price for the bride. It could be in the form of livestock, it could be in the form of money, it could be in the form of a variety of things of wealth. And the reason you did this is that you were taking a productive hand out of her father's household. She could work the flocks, she could tend the fields. In fact, when Jacob meets Rachel, what is she doing? She's watering her dad's flocks. She's a shepherdess. And so when Jacob marries Rachel, he is going to take that productive set of hands out of that family. And in a very primitive agrarian society, every pair of hands is essential for economic survival. Therefore, the bride price you paid was a replacement to the father for some of the economic loss he would face as a result of giving up this pair of hard-working, healthy hands. Now, it was better if you kept the bride price within the clan, because if I pay the bride price to my uncle, then the clan still has those cattle, still has those resources. At the same time, by paying the bride price within the clan, I'm also in a position in which this woman now is able to produce children for this clan. Whereas if she's sold to another clan, her children become the hands in that clan. So there's a strong social pressure on cousins marrying cousins, half-sisters marrying half-brothers, and you will find this all the way through the book of Genesis, and it looks very strange to us. But it doesn't look strange if you study those kinds of cultures even as they exist today. The other thing that we noted about this is that if the ability to produce lots of hands was the key to first physical protection, because the clan had to be its own defense agency. There was no 911 to call when the bad guys came. And it was going to be, then there was advantage to a man having more than one wife, because it meant producing more productive offspring. Keep in mind that a lot of kids are going to die in infancy. A lot of going to die as very young men and women. And so you need a lot of kids at the start to have a reasonably sizable population in middle age and old age. And one of the ways to do this is for a man to have a multiplicity of wives. And at the end of the hour yesterday, we were talking about some of the conventions and mores that govern the relationships between a man and a wife in these situations where there are several wives. You will notice if you read the book of Genesis that Leah and Rachel each have separate tents. You remember when Laban had accused Jacob of stealing the household gods? And he made a tent-by-tent search for them. And you'll find it refers that he went from Leah's tent to Rachel's tent. Very typically, what would happen is that each of the wives would have her own tent where she and her own offspring lived. And the husband would simply move from one tent to another in the evenings, sleeping with one woman one night, another woman another night. And as we said yesterday, there were certain mores and customs that governed who he could sleep with. That is to say, he couldn't tonight say, well, I think I will sleep with so-and-so, and the next night I think I will sleep with someone else. There was an established protocol in which each wife had equal rights to the husband. The reason that right was protected is because her children were her security in old age. And this was to protect a wife from being neglected by a husband so that when he died, she had no offspring to take care of her in old age. So you had, in effect, an agreement among the wives that I have him on Monday, and you have him on Tuesday, and you have him on Wednesday, and you have him on Thursday. And he was not obligated, if wife A had the conjugal rights on Monday, he was not obligated to sleep with her on Monday, but he could not sleep with any of the other wives on Monday. She alone had rights to that. However, she could negotiate the rights with another woman. If for some reason there were advantage to doing so, just like in those of you who've been in the military, you had a watch and you needed to be free that night and you swapped off the watch with somebody else who had the watch later in the week, these wives could do the same thing. And that's what is going on in this interesting story between Rachel and Leah when Leah's son comes in with the mandrakes from the field. Turn with me, if you will, to Genesis chapter 30. We were in this chapter last time, but we were not quite to this point, and I wanted to discuss it before we went on. Come to the 14th verse of Genesis 30. In the days of the wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Is it a small matter for you to take my husband, and should you take my son's mandrakes also?" Because if you'll remember, what was happening is Jacob was not going into Leah on her nights. He was sleeping with Rachel, but she was not conceiving. And the nights that Leah had claim to him, he simply wasn't going into her. He was sleeping with Zilpah and Bilhah, the handmaids. But part of his rejection of Leah was he was no longer sleeping with her. And so she says, is it not enough that you've already stolen my husband, but that now then you're going to have my son's mandrakes? Now, what is the issue with the mandrakes? There was a strong belief among those people that mandrakes made you sexually productive. Rachel, who has not been able to have a child, wants the mandrakes because she believes it will stimulate her womb and allow her to become pregnant. And so Leah's son has inadvertently found a rare medicine, if you would, that can help her become pregnant. She wants the mandrakes. And so she says to Leah, "Give me some of the mandrakes." And Leah says, "Should I give you the mandrakes, knowing why you want them and who you'll be sleeping with, when I don't even have the privilege of that man who is my husband as well?" So Leah said, "I'm going to negotiate a deal with you. I'm going to negotiate a deal with you." Here's how she does it. Rachel said, "Herein is how we could go at this. He may lie with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes." What she's saying is, tonight's my night. I will take your mandrakes, and what I will pay you for the mandrakes is that you get him tonight. Now, when that kind of deal was negotiated between two wives, the man lost the option. At that point, he was obligated to sleep with the wife who had bought the conjugal rights. That was a universal custom in the ancient world. And so now then, Leah is going to go out and grab Jacob and say, "Tonight, buddy, my tent." Okay? That's what happens. Look at verse 16. When Jacob came in from the field in the evening, then Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her that night, and God gave heed to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Okay? That's what's going on in that interesting little story that you probably read through in Genesis many times and thought, what on earth is going on here? It is the scenes in these multiple wife families in the ancient world, and that you would still find in the Bedouin families of the Middle East today. Questions or comments about that, or any of the things we were talking about yesterday at the end of the hour on rights of inheritance and which son has priority for the inheritance in these kinds of situations? Any questions on that? Because we're going to shift gears considerably here real quickly.
How did the daughters fare in this?
The daughters fared as being protected by their brothers, but they would be married to someone else. You have the case of Dinah, who is the only girl in this family, marry to Shechem, to build an alliance with the men of Shechem. But the brothers pulled that famous ruse and killed the men of Shechem. Jacob would have assumed all along that Dinah would leave the family. She might not leave the clan, although at this point he seems willing to let her leave the clan. You've got to keep in mind that when Jacob lets Dinah be a point of negotiation with the men of Shechem, he has just fled from Laban, and he's not yet joined forces with Esau or with his father Isaac, who may still be alive at this point. And so Jacob's got a very small clan. And he doesn't really have within that clan someone that she could marry to. Whereas if it were a 4 or 5 generational clan, which would be more typical in these situations, if he was still back in Laban's household, there was probably someone within the clan he could have married Dinah to. But he really doesn't have that option within this clan that is now reduced to size because he's a fugitive on the run. And so he looks at being willing to marry her for the right bride price to someone else, in this case the prince of Shechem. Okay. Yes?
Along with that, the daughters, when the land was parceled out until it was called, they were called to attention.
When you go into the land, Joshua is not giving land to women until a group of women come to him and say, there are no men in our household. Does that mean that we are eternally propertyless? And Joshua said, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Okay, we've got to make some provision for the women who have no man who can be their sponsor in land ownership. But you're right, the women are excluded from the laws of inheritance, from the laws of property passing. In fact, what you're going to see, and let me tell you, the next section we're going to is going to bother some of you. It always does when I go into this. But what you're going to see when we get into the law of Moses is that women are treated as another class of property. That's what they are. They are property, just like cattle and anything else, and you negotiate and you assess proper entitlement to women. The law of Moses treats women just like another class of property, which is the way that it was in the day that Moses put this law together. You would have found that that was the way most of the nomadic Semitic people treated women. So Dinah was another piece of property. Yes, loved, yes, cherished, yes, protected, but who would be a tool for negotiation with someone that the family needed to form an alliance with. Marriages were not because you were madly in love, it was because it was politically or economically advantageous to put this woman with that man. Yes, ma'am?
This was not the way God intended, but just the way it was.
What you find in Moses is an interesting combination of both some legislation that acknowledges the reality of fallen man, and that you can't take any society and force on it laws that are too big a discontinuity from the way they already do things. For instance, I've got a good friend, member of the church, who is in South Africa today for his 47th trip to South Africa. And he is the primary advisor to de Klerk in the dismantlement of apartheid. And when he goes to South Africa, he sits down with de Klerk, he sits down with Bishop Tutu, he sits down with Mandela and the ANC, he sits down with the chief of the Zulus, and they try to work through the vast differences in values and perspectives that these people have to try to find some way to bring this thing together. And one of the big problems he has with the Zulus is that the Zulus have never had an agrarian revolution, much less an industrial revolution, and you're trying to take them in one generation to full participation in an international democracy. And the shift is so great that it is just destroying the Zulu sense of identity. Because you've got kids who are being educated to have a place in this government who are just completely disconnected in terms of values and the way they look at the world from their parents. And so the whole tribal mechanism is just going through tremendous chaos. You can only take a human being who is used to doing things a certain way and move them so far by saying you must do it this way now without creating tremendous upheaval. So there is in Moses on one side a tremendous tendency at times to say, okay, this may not be God's ideal, but this is what we've got to work with to make this society work. After all, that's what Jesus says Moses did with the bill of divorce. Wasn't God's ideal, but out of the hardness of hearts he was dealing with, Moses had to find some way to protect women. And so he said, okay, if you're going to divorce your wife, you've got to give her a bill of divorce. You can't just send her away. You've got to give her a bill of divorce. So you've got that on one hand. On the other hand, there is in Moses some of the most far-sighted stuff that not only did Israel never quite bring itself to practice it, we couldn't bring ourselves to practice it today, but if we could, man, what a different world it would be. Part of this is the legislation of the Jubilee year. Moses provided that there would never be perpetual poverty in Israel. And the way he did it is to say, when you go into the land, everybody gets a piece of land that is large enough to support their family with. Now, if Jim turns out to be a poor manager and he gets so deep in debt that he loses that land to a foreclosure to his lenders, every time the Jubilee year comes around, which was every 50 years, whoever got that land has to give it back to his descendants. So that land is never perpetually alienated from a family. At most, one generation is going to go by before the family gets the land back and can begin to rebuild their own wherewithal. The communists never had such a radical land distribution policy. Okay? I mean, that is far left-wing stuff, even in the 20th century, okay? It was very visionary. And had Israel stuck to that and really respected the Jubilee year, there would have probably never been a problem of poverty within the nation. It was a very visionary thing. So that the law of Moses is this interesting combination of some things that are embodiments of God's ideals and holding people to that, other places where God's ideal is here but realities are here, and it sort of accommodates that without saying that's okay. It says, okay, we'll work with that. And then other places it's stretching the imagination of what could possibly come if society could reconfigure itself in certain ways. It's an interesting body of law. Okay? Well, let's look at some things that happen with women under this body of law. The period in which Israel is settled in the land of Canaan. First of all, family units start becoming smaller. Because now then you've got seed, the number of hands to operate in that environment that you do when you've got huge herds that are wandering over hundreds of square miles to find foliage and water. You need a lot of workers, you need a lot of people along to protect the herds, you need a big support staff to run this big grazing operation. That's not necessary once you're running a more settled, localized economy. Multiple wives become less common. In fact, when we go into the period of Israel and its settled state, about the only time you run into multiple wives now is going to be in the families of the royalty. David has several wives. Solomon has several wives. Saul has several wives. Occasionally you will find someone who is not in the royalty who has a multiplicity of wives, but fundamentally you don't see this as commonplace as you have in the book of Genesis. And it is in this period of time, as we mentioned yesterday, that a transition begins, in which now, instead of the man bringing to the father a price for the bride, the father starts sending the bride with money to the groom. The dowry, as we think of it. And the purpose of that dowry was to guarantee that when this woman was given to me as a wife, I would not quickly dismiss her or flippantly dismiss her later. Because if I put her out, I had to return the dowry to her father. Thus, if I had spent the dowry, I had to find some way to repay her father, who would then take the dowry I returned to him and support her in her singleness. And until I could provide him that means of supporting his daughter, I could not put her on the street. So there's this shift. Wives were procured in one of four ways, and we're going to look at a number of passages here. I'm glad each of you were grabbing Bibles a while ago. Let's turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 22. And see how a man went about procuring a wife. They had interesting computerized dating services in those days. It was called Dad and Dad sitting down and saying, let's make a deal. When you come to Deuteronomy 22, let's look at the language that begins at verse 13. We're going to read a lengthy section here and then talk about the implications of several points having to do with it. If any man takes a wife and goes into to her and then turns against her, and charges her with shameful deeds and publicly defames her, and says, I took this woman, but when I came near her, I did not find her a virgin. Then the girl's father and her girl's virginity to the elders of the city at the gate. Now, this is not one of these passages that you read and you say, what on earth is going on here? The King James translates it, she'll bring out the tokens of her virginity. My goodness, what are we talking about? Well, we're going to get into that in a moment. And the girl's father shall say to the elders, I gave my daughter to this man for a wife, but he turned against her. And behold, he has charged her with shameful deeds, saying, I did not find your daughter a virgin. But this is the evidence of my daughter's virginity. And they shall spread the garment before the elders of the city. So at least you know it's some kind of garment that we're dealing with here. Okay? So the elders of the city shall take the man and chastise him. Probably means they whip him with whips. And they shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give it to the girl's father. You're already starting to see a pattern here that you will see all the way through the law of Moses. Is that when a man wrongs a woman, it's not the woman who gets the settlement. It's her dad. Her dad gets the settlement. The fine doesn't go to this woman whose name he has besmirched. The fine goes to the woman's father. Okay? They shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give it to the girl's father, because he publicly defamed a virgin of Israel. And she shall remain his wife. He cannot divorce her all his days. But if this charge is true, that the girl was not found a virgin, then they shall bring out the girl to the doorway of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her to death, because she has committed an act of folly in Israel by playing the harlot in her father's house. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. What's going on here? They have now moved to a scenario in which the betrothal is considered the commitment of a man and woman as married. When they speak of a betrothal, they don't mean quite the same thing we do when we speak of an engagement. Because as far as the law was concerned, as far as Israel was concerned, once you were betrothed, the marriage was in effect. And the only way you could get out of that betrothal was through death or divorce. See, now we can break an engagement off by simply saying, no, I don't want to go through with this thing. You couldn't here. Once you agreed to the betrothal, she was his wife. But the relationship had not yet been consummated sexually, and would not be for several months, as a rule for a year to come. During that year, two things are happening. One is the man who is going to marry this woman is preparing the place where they will live. And number two, the woman who will be married is pulling together her trousseau, and her father is getting the dowry pulled together. Everything is being put in order. If it's in the earlier day when the husband has together. And so in Jacob's case, he had to work 7 years to get the bride price together before he could go to Laban and say, okay, I'm ready for this woman. Now, they're married, but this means that if she has sexual relations at this point with another man, she's an adulteress, will be stoned as an adulteress. Yes, let me get a couple of comments here.
That's the case that we found Mary. Joseph.
Exactly. Joseph is in the very situation with Mary. They've not come together yet, but she's with child, which means she is an adulteress and should be stoned by the strictest interpretation of the law. Yes?
Were there vows taken in the betrothal?
Only a made it real.
God always demanded that they fulfill their vows.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. The vows that we think of as the vows of matrimony don't occur until the wedding day. But the commitment was binding. It goes back to what I was saying in my lesson this morning, that in the Middle East, when you speak a word, it has living reality, and you don't revoke it, because it lives on its own. And so when this woman said, I will give myself to you as your wife, that was a binding agreement that was irrevocable at that point. Part of the man who came to her father. There were provisions, but basically it was a binding agreement. Now then, at the point that she is in readiness and he is in readiness, that all of the things that must take place at the final negotiation, you can think of this betrothal as sort of your down payment, your earnest money you put down on a house. Then you go get the financing lined up, and the people who are in the house arrange a date that they can move out. And once everybody's got everything in order, then you come together for the formal closing. Well, that's sort of the way they do a marriage. When it's time to come together for the formal closing, he and his friends go to her place and escort her with great fanfare to the new home that he has prepared for them. And there is a wedding ceremony in which vows are exchanged, and then something that would be very uncomfortable to us occurs. He takes his bride, and they consummate the marriage sexually while their friends wait in the other room. Okay? And that formally establishes the union. At the point that he has consummated the marriage sexually, he walks out and announces that the marriage is consummated. There's a great passage in the Psalms that refers to God coming like the bridegroom out of his chamber. And it's a passage that's talking about God's beaming joy. And it's an allusion to the bridegroom coming out of the chamber saying, "We are one." There are two women, somewhat like midwives, who are standing by, who at the moment of his announcement go into the bedchamber where she is, helps her to dress, and takes the bed clothing of her first penetration that is marked by the blood of her first penetration and put their identifying mark on it, so that in the future they can say, yes, this is the bed clothing upon which her virginity came to an end. Then they fold that up and they give it to her parents, where later the husband comes to the elders and says, this woman wasn't a virgin when I married her. Now then, her parents can defend her by bringing out the bed clothing and calling in the midwives and saying, is this your mark? And the midwives can say to the elders of the city, yes, she was a virgin when she went into that bedchamber. We can vouch for that. Okay. And so as a result, it gives a protection to the woman. Now that's a very, very different custom for us. You know, that would make us terribly uncomfortable to be asked to be part of a wedding ceremony that went forward like that. But that's what's happening here. These women can attest to the fact that this woman was a virgin on her wedding night. Because if she can't establish that virginity, she is subject to stoning to death. So this is serious stuff. A lot of these things that you will see in Moses are ways that he is protecting a woman from arbitrary accusation and attack in a world in which men had all the options and women had very few. So yes, Keith?
It would also be interesting that we are dealing a lot with the incest situation now. That would be something that would probably protect from happening.
Oh yes, exactly. I had not thought about that, but that's exactly right. In that kind of world, a father committing incest with his daughter just destroyed her bride price. You know, she cannot be married off as a virgin. And if you read Moses, you find that once a woman loses her virginity, her bride price is gone in their world. Interesting point. Now, holding this place, because we're going to come back to Deuteronomy 22, I want you to go over to Exodus chapter 21. What we've just seen is a case of a compact with a free woman who is to become your wife. But you could also go buy a slave to make her your wife. That's what Exodus 21 covers, beginning in verse 7. If a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves do. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master who designated her for himself, now that's the key. This is a woman who has been sold into slavery because a man has said, I want to take that woman as a slave wife. Okay. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master who designated her for himself, then he shall let father a certain amount of money to buy her as a slave, and he intends to make of her a slave wife. But once he brings her into his home, if he suddenly decides, no, I don't like this woman after all, then her family has the right to buy her back out of slavery, to take the money that was paid for her, return it, and she can go free. She is not reduced to perpetual slavery in that household. he does not have the authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. He has breached contract with her, in effect. And therefore, he has to pay a price. One of the prices is he can't sell her outside the immediate clan. And if he designates her for his son, maybe he bought this woman as a slave to give as a wife to his son. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. So he buys this woman as a slave, he makes her his slave wife, and then he finds another woman that he enters into a marriage with. That's more nearly the sort of thing we read first from Deuteronomy. Free person and free person joining up. If he does that, that's okay, Moses says, but he can't go back to the slave wife and say, okay, I'm going to reduce your support, and you don't sleep with me anymore. She is to be protected in her conjugal rights. Why? Again, because her offspring are her security in her old age. She must be given the opportunity to bring children into this world so that she will have someone to take care of her when she becomes aged. He says, if he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. And if he will not do these three things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. She can walk. One of the few places under the Judaic system in which a woman could walk away from a marriage scot-free. If he will not give her her conjugal rights, she's no longer bound to this marriage. So the passage of Deuteronomy is not the only place that provides for the dissolution of a marriage under Moses. There are several places where a woman, having been in a sexual union with a man who called himself her husband, is going to be given the option to move out of that and go into another relation someplace else. That's very important for you to keep in mind when we look at what the New Testament says about divorce and remarriage in the context of Old Testament legislation, which Jesus was always dealing with in his comments. Now then, we've seen a free woman whose marriage is negotiated. We've seen a slave woman who is bought in order to become a wife. Now we're going to see a third way in which people became wives back in Deuteronomy 21. So go back over there with me again. This time, we're going to begin reading at verse 10. Is that right? Yes. And these are the words. When you go out to battle against your enemies, and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands, and you take them away captive, and see among the captives a beautiful woman, and have a desire for her, and would take her as a wife for yourself, then you shall bring her home to your house, and she shall shave her head and trim her nails. She shall also remove the clothes of her captivity, and shall remain in your house, and mourn her father and mother a full month. You're to give her a chance to work through the initial mourning of having lost her family in this war. And the shaving of the head and the clipping of the nails is part of the purification rites that were commonly associated with ceremonies of purification in the ancient world. She shall also remove the clothes of her captivity, shall remain in your house, and mourn her father and mother a full month, and after that you may go into her and be her husband, and she will be your wife. Now I want you to notice, they are husband and wife. You shall be her husband, she shall be your wife. And it shall be, if you are not pleased with her, then you shall let her go wherever she wishes. But you shall certainly not sell her for money. You shall not mistreat her, because you have humbled her. She can walk away from this relationship. You see, that's strange stuff to us, isn't it? That this man has a right to take this woman who's a captive and say, you're going to become my wife. And then after he's had sex with her for a while, it's like, I don't want her after all. What does that woman have a right to do? Moses says she has a right to go. He cannot mistreat her. He cannot sell her as a slave. Even though she was a captive, she is free to go. Now what you begin to see in these patterns, I think if you watch for it, is that Moses' legislation contrariness. That's a piece of the legislation of Moses that is often overlooked. is that he is trying to be sure that women are not needlessly victimized in a world in which, as we've said, men tended to have all the options. So let's look at one more. This is a very interesting one. This one is back in Exodus 21, having to do with slavery. So far, we've been talking about a man who is free and a wife who is either a free woman, a slave woman, or a captive woman. But what if the man himself is a slave? What is the legislation that will cover his relationship? Come to Exodus 21, verse 2. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve you for 6 years, but on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment. That is, the idea is that he has given you enough income, enough productivity in 7 years that he's bought his freedom. So at the end of 7 years, every slave goes free. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If you buy a man as a slave and he's already married, the wife lives with him while he's a slave. When the tenure of his slavery is finished and he leaves, the wife and the children leave. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a free man, then he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. Now, why would a man ever do that? Well, because of the verse we skipped. Notice what he says. Gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters. The wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. He's a single man when he becomes a slave. The master gives him another slave as a wife. He has children by that woman. His 7 years is up, and it's time for him to go. But the woman and the children, this man comes back to the master and says, I don't want to go out without my wife and my children. Then his option is to become a permanent slave so that he can stay in this marriage. Interesting, isn't it? Those are the 4 ways then in which people got wives. They negotiated with a free woman. They bought a slave. They took a captive. They were given a wife by the master that they had as a slave. It's a rather different kind of cultural milieu from anything that we're familiar with. Questions about any of those stories before we go on? Yes, ma'am.
Where could a woman go if she left her husband for any legitimate reason?
It's one of the great problems in their society. What did a woman do when she left her husband in that world? Keep in mind, she probably couldn't own property in most cases.
Maybe that's what Jesus said, that it caused a woman to commit adultery.
I believe that is fundamentally underlying what Jesus says in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 when he talks about a man divorcing a woman. And if you will read Matthew 5 and 19 as you should read it, not as the ways it sometimes is read through our filters, he does not say the woman is guilty of adultery. The guilt in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 19 is on the husband that divorces her. He makes her to become an adulteress. In fact, one of the problems with Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 is the particular verb form that Jesus uses there. When he says that she commits adultery, he doesn't use an active voice, he uses a passive voice verb. It's not that she commits adultery, she has adultery done to her. We don't have the capability to do that. But that's what Jesus does in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19. He doesn't say she goes out and commits adultery. He says that she becomes adulterized. Okay? And the sin is not on her. Look at the way the sentence is structured syntactically. He causes her, that's the verb, he causes her to be adulterized. Jesus is putting the onus not back on the woman, but back on the man who arbitrarily said, go, here's your bill of divorcement, out of here. Okay? Because one of the problems that you have is that in a society where women can't own land and can't run businesses, what does a woman do to survive? She ends up in harlotry, or she ends up, in some kind of what we would consider improper moral relationship in order to have the means and the wherewithal to get by. It is identical to the problem we have in many parts of Africa today if you go in and take a man who has 2 or 3 wives and convert him and tell him you've got to get rid of 2 of your wives. there is no place for that woman to go except out to prostitution. And, you know, I can't counsel any missionary to give that advice. You know, if God can work with families that are in this kind of situation under Moses, he can work with families in this situation under Christ. Because after all, there's a lot more grace in Christ than there was under Moses. And we don't have to force women into situations that are ungodly in order to stick to some narrow interpretation. But unfortunately, an ideal that may not always be doable. Heston?
I think along with this ways to get wives, I can't recall, was it the tribe of Reuben that was killed the women?
No, it was the tribe of Benjamin.
Benjamin.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they other tribes said we can't let them dance or something other like that, and they can swoop down and grab them a wife.
This is that famous story at the end of Judges, in which there's a civil war in Israel, in which 11 of the tribes go to war against Benjamin because Benjamin has protected a group of immoral men in the city of Gibeah. And the 11 other tribes, when they form for war, take an oath among themselves that none of them will give their daughters in marriage to men of Benjamin. And then they go in, and the war wages so furiously that Benjamin is all but obliterated. Everybody then wakes up to the fact that we can't allow Benjamin to just disappear in Israel. But where will they find wives now? We have wiped out the whole population. There are only a few hundred men left in Benjamin. But we've also said we will not give our daughters in marriage to them. So what can we do? So they come up with this little thing where they send their eligible daughters out dancing at this festival and tell the men of Benjamin, if you happen to be lying in an ambush when these women happen to be dancing on this hillside and you happen to take them captive, we're not going to do anything about it. So everybody gets to keep his word. I mean, it's a great legalist solution to a problem. I mean, it's a very, very clever thing. Nobody has to be responsible. It's sort of like I was telling someone at lunch. A fellow I know who's a counselor is talking about how people can make statements to you in counseling that seem to answer a question but really don't give you any information. And he had asked his little 2-year-old boy, what happened to the chocolate chip cookies on the table? And the boy looked at him and said, when people leave chocolate chip cookies out, people will eat them. No guilt acknowledged, no plea entered, just this is the way it is. Okay, other observations. Yes, Bill?
There seems in all this to be no leeway for a marriage that's purely met down at the synagogue and
yeah.
next to each other and fell in love.
Rachel and Jacob seem to approach a father would respond to a daughter or you know, to a man coming saying, I've fallen in love with your daughter, I'd like to marry him. You've got the Boaz and Ruth story, which is very much this kind of thing. But notice that even where the romance is involved, the proper negotiations must go forward. And if the... Yes. That's right. It comes back under it. You still must negotiate for this wife, even though you're marrying her out of a romantic commitment to her. But typically what happened in these marriages is that we have a model in which two people meet up and romance blooms, and out of romance marriage comes, and out of that you work through the commitments. Their world reversed the order. You make a commitment to someone and you marry them, and out of working through that commitment together, the romance comes. And so one of the interests has a very romantic theme involving couples in their 50s and 60s and 70s. Their view is that romance comes at the end of the process, not at the start of the process. Whereas our sort of view is romance gets it started and then the romance burns out, and sheer will and commitment keep it going from there on, you see.
You may be covering this in your next session, but just, are you going to touch this end of Ezra? That situation? Raise
the question.
I don't think I'm
okay.
aware. I mean, what do it just seems like a horrible thing. They have to
give up their wives. And if you will notice, it is a giving up the wives because of the religious influence they will have. That is the problem. Israel has in the past been compromised spiritually because of marriages with other nations, and people brought those spiritual and moral outlooks into the household of Israel. So Solomon's intermarriages with other nations end up spiritually compromising himself, his family, and ultimately his nation. When Ezra leads a group coming back out of Babylonian captivity, they have come back with a singular devotion to serve God purely. There may have been occasional problems, not occasional problems, frequent problems with idolatry in Israel before the Babylonian captivity. There will be none after the Babylonian captivity. The Pharisees come out of the commitment to getting back to a serious restoration of what Moses called us to. In fact, the Pharisees are the restoration movement of the post-Babylonian captivity era. And so in this moment in which there is such a commitment to practicing pure religion, God says, if you're going to do that, you've got to do something with this fifth column spiritually that has worked its way in through these intermarriages. You've got to get rid of the wives and children who bring a different religion into Israel. And so it's a matter of maintaining spiritual rather than any kind of biological purity. That is the concern there in Ezra, and only because Ezra is at a moment in which such a singular opportunity is upon Israel as a nation to fight. And in fact, it does work out that way. Jim, and then I'll come back to you, and I'll get your comment too.
This may be more of a can of worms than you want to do right now, but how do you see this information impacting what Jesus said and what the Apostle Paul said about marriage and divorce? I know you talked a little bit about this idea of making someone an adulteress. You talked a little bit about that, but take that a step or two further.
Let me tell you where I am in my own study of that. And I said yesterday we were not going to really deal too much with the marriage-divorce issue in the contemporary church, but since I've sort of invited your question by talking about these issues, let me tell you where I am in my work through of this. As I said yesterday, one of the interesting things about divorce and remarriage in the New Testament is that really so little is said about it. You might say, well, there's a lot said in the New Testament about it, but if you study it carefully, there's not very much said about it from this standpoint, that we have 5 statements from Jesus on the subject. 5 different passages. But if you analyze those 5 passages, you will find that there are 3 versions of one story and 2 versions of another. You really only have 2 statements of Jesus. You just typically have 3 Gospels that tell one of those stories and 2 Gospels that tell another. So you've got 5 all told. But what you end up with is 2 statements from Jesus on the subject of divorce and remarriage. What is interesting to me is that as much as we see a problem with divorce and remarriage in the contemporary world, we haven't touched the hem of the garment of what was going on in the 1st century in the Roman Empire. We're nowhere near the divorce-remarriage problem they had. And it manifested itself in a number of ways. I was a little bit late to class because I'd gone down to Powell's bookstore to try to find a particular book that I had been needing to document a point that I made in writing recently and got challenged by someone on. But I knew this book and built that case very powerfully, and I wanted to have it available as a resource. In the Roman Empire, at least half, and some sociologists believe 6th century, and slaves could not, under Roman law, have a legal marriage. It was forbidden. Marriages between slaves had no legal standing under Roman law. So if this man were my slave and I gave him this woman as a wife, it was what we would call a common law liaison. But if I decided to sell him 5 years later, he went that way and she stayed here and I gave her to another man. And Christianity penetrated deeply into the slave class. And I am absolutely amazed with the problem of divorce and remarriage that is chronicled even by the secular authors of the 1st century. And the fact that with slaves you had no legal marriages to begin with, but all kinds of live-in arrangements that these people have been in and out of, this issue. Now, when I first began to realize that about 10 years ago, what came to my mind is, if they were teaching in the 1st century the same thing I've been teaching in the 20th century, it would have been a big issue in Scripture. Follow me? I mean, if circumcision was a big issue, this would have been a biggie, because a vast majority of the people who were coming into the church had messed up marriages in their background, or marriages that did not have legal standing in their background. And so that made me stop and think, you know, am I handling these texts right? And so I began to study it afresh with these 5 statements of Jesus and boil them down to the two statements, Matthew 5 and Matthew 19. In both cases, what you have is Jesus talking to an audience of people under the law, and his subject is how to interpret the law. He is talking to people under the law about how you interpret the law of Moses. Look at Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount. It comes in a setting in which Jesus says, you've heard the law interpreted of old as blah, blah, blah. Let me tell you, you should interpret it blah. And he is explaining to them how to properly interpret the provisions of Moses. Matthew 19, it's very clear. The people come to him and say, is it lawful? Now notice that question. Is it lawful? That's the way you put a question to a rabbi when you wanted him to explain the technical language of the law. They're not asking him, is it God's eternal will? Is this the way it should always be? They're saying, under Moses, how do you interpret the bill of divorcement clause? And so Jesus is answering the question to people who live under the law about how you interpret the law, which means that what happens under the law and what happens in the Old Testament is very relevant to the New Testament discussion. It's a central background. I can't just start at Matthew and discuss marriage and divorce. I've got to go back and look at how God deals with things all the way through the Old Testament. When I do that, it seems to me that there are 4 principles that define what we see in the Old Testament with regard to divorce and remarriage. And I want to use sort of 4 borders around a field here to illustrate this. First up here is God's nature. God's nature is that He is a covenant-making, covenant-keeping God. You know, I think we all agree with that. Therefore, out of that nature, God has a standard that is the standard from which almost all other standards is. You make a covenant, you keep a covenant. And when you come to marriage, that means one man, one woman, one life. That's the standard. But over against God's nature and God's standard, which define the ideal, stands reality. Ideal is defined along this. But there's another axis that crosses. This end of the reality is human nature. And you can call this what you want. You can call it the fallenness of man. You can call it the hardness of heart that Jesus talks about in Matthew 19. Call it what you want to. But this reality means that in this world there are going to be people who do not live up to that standard. Now then, what does God do with people who don't live up to that standard? What we have just seen in Moses is a lot of provisions by which God says, okay, I will accommodate. I will find a way to work with it. God does this all the way through the Old Testament. When Samuel comes to him and says, they want a king, what does God say? Not my ideal, but I'll accommodate it. We'll find a way to work with him. David comes to him and says, I want to build a temple. God says, not my command. But if that's what you want to do, here's how we'll do that. All the way through the Old Testament, God makes provision to accommodate things that are not His ideal, but which He will work with in order to stay in a working relationship with man. And so, in Moses, given the reality of human nature, in this arena of marital relations, in order for God to stay in relationship with people who do not meet His ideal, there's a provision of grace. I won't hold you to the ideal. I will hold the ideal up. I will continue to preach it. But I will work with you even though you have stepped on it and you don't measure up to the ideal. Now, I can't find any other principles than those 4 that govern what I discover in the Old Testament about how God deals with families that are messed up in the ways we've seen these families messed up. His nature, His standard, man's nature, and the grace which God gives in order for these people to stay in His covenant community. Now then, here is the question. Do we have fewer options to work with people under Christ than we did under Moses? Think about that one for a while. Because this gets into what you do with the man with 4 wives in Central Africa, as well as what we do with people who've messed up their marriages in this world. Do we have more freedom or less freedom to work with people under Christ than we did under Moses? I had always taught that. I hadn't said it explicitly, but the Bryce than there are under Moses. If that's the case, then the field of possibilities that God will work with has been reduced. One of the fences has moved in. Now, which one is it? If I say God's nature has changed, I'm straight into 2nd century heresy. It was Marcion in the 2nd century who said the God of the New Testament is not the same God of the Old Testament. And the church very quickly settled that one. No, God's nature is constant throughout Scripture. If I say God's standard has changed, I deny what Jesus said in Matthew 19. Jesus said from the beginning, it has been one man, one woman, one life. That hasn't changed, even though God made some accommodations along the way through the bill of divorcement. If I say that human nature has changed, then I don't see much evidence human nature is any better today than it was then. So to say that the field of possibility has been reduced means that there is less grace under Christ than there is under Moses, which seems to get me in a whole lot of trouble with Hebrews, the whole book of Hebrews. Okay? So my conclusion is I have to come back to the New Testament passages and not interpret them in a way that reduces God's grace under Christ. And any interpretation I force upon Matthew 5 or Matthew 19 that diminishes the amount of grace available to fallen man is a misinterpretation of that passage, no matter how well it fits syntactically and grammatically, this passage. You have to interpret the explicit verses in terms of the broader principles, in other words. And so instead of starting here and working out, I've started trying to work out here and come in. Now, where does that leave me? My study, and I won't go into the reasons for this, have led me to believe there is no biblical grounds for divorce. Not even adultery. The more I study it, the more I'm convinced that Jesus was not giving an out for the man whose wife had committed adultery in Matthew 5, that he's saying something else altogether. I won't go into that. I am the most conservative person you will ever find on what constitutes an appropriate divorce. None. It is still the standard, one man, one woman for one life, period. But when it comes to working with people who failed of that standard, I probably reach my arms out about as broadly as anyone you'll see. As some kind of legalist, ultra-conservative right-winger, you bump into me another place, you look at me as some kind of left-wing stand-for-nothing liberal, see? But I'm simply trying to be consistent with what I see in Scripture. I see God working with some situations in these passages in Moses that are unconscionable to me. They're just unconscionable to me. But if that's the kind of grace that is there under Moses with an imperfect system of sacrifices, how much more grace is available to work with people in a system where there's a perfect sacrifice? Amen. So it's an interesting tension to try to work with, but I believe it reflects the way that we have to do it. Well, our time is gone. I've gone well over with that little comment.